So this next unit of class is going to be about evolution, and we're going to talk a bit about Charles Darwin. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the background before Darwin and how have our ideas changed, and what were some early ideas about how organisms appeared on the planet and how they have changed over time. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the history in this lesson. So most people, when you think of the word evolution or you think of natural selection, you think of Charles Darwin. But really, the idea of evolution didn't come from Darwin. It came from way before Darwin. The idea of evolution has actually been around for a long time. And when we say the word evolution, really what we're talking about is change. So evolution, that word means that things are changing. Evolution is a fact. Okay, it's not a theory. Evolution is a fact because it's a fact that things change. Where the theory comes in, where Darwin comes in, is understanding how they change. But we have plenty of evidence that things are changing. The question is, why? And we'll get to that later. But this idea that things change and things are changing and witnessing these changes has been around for long before Darwin. So let's go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Ancient Greeks, there were some different ideas around at that time, but most believed that all organisms were created at the same time. And then they believed that there was this linking together of organisms, like links on a chain, sort of one to the next to the next. And they sort of believed that there was this hierarchy or this system where organisms were more and more sort of not really evolved, but more, they were smarter and they were, better in some way, and that there was like some height you could reach. So you may have heard of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, and he came up with this idea of this chain of being, like I said, like links on a chain, starting with non-being, that is, things that are not alive, like the earth and minerals, and then plants were just slightly more sophisticated than that, and then we had animals, and then we had man right here in the middle, and then achieving higher and higher were demons and angels and eventually God. That was Aristotle's idea. Now within this, there was even a hierarchy with the animals leading up to man, and this isn't all of them, but he had an entire hierarchy starting with, here it's showing worms at the bottom, and then you move on up till you end up with monkeys and man at the top. So he had this idea that there were smarter, better animals and dumber, I guess, and not so good animals. Now, these ideas persisted until about the 15th century. And at that time, European, sort of the seat of science was in Europe. And the European naturalists, these are people that study nature, they had not really traveled very far outside of Europe. And so mainly they only knew European species. There was really no widespread travel at that time. Once there were explorers began reaching out and visiting to other continents and other countries, this introduced to the naturalist a wider diversity of life. They saw things that they had never seen before in other countries, and the field of biogeography was born. This is the study of organisms by their location. What naturalists, one of the first things they noticed was that there were many similar organisms that were far, far away. So they weren't the same organism, but they had so many similar characteristics. And this is going to become important later when we talk about natural selection. But let me give you an example. Large flightless birds are found on almost every continent, but there are different species. Let's take a look. Here are 3 different species of flightless bird. Here we have an Australian emu, and this is kind of what they look like. We have from South America, here, the rhea, R-H-E-A, the rhea. This is from South America. And then we have, from Africa, we have the ostrich. So they share so many things in common. The long, strong back legs, they're flightless, that is, their wings don't serve to help them fly. The long necks, all these characteristics they share in common, but they're on different continents, far apart from each other. So this led to some new theories. We're going to start with this gentleman, Georges Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, and this is in the 1700s. He was one of the first to propose that organisms changed over time, and the traits that changed were passed on. So descent with modification. And he thought over time the environment could alter organisms. So some of the first ideas that were similar to Darwin's, but he still held to the idea of creation and the idea that species were pretty constant. His ideas didn't catch on. He was met with a lot of opposition to his ideas in the 1700s, but he influenced Darwin and he influenced some of the later scientists. Next, we have this gentleman, Georges Cuvier, and his theory was called catastrophism. Catastrophism says that all these changes that we've seen and the extinction that we've seen has to do with catastrophes that have happened on the planet, like floods and volcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts and things like that, that all species, he believed, were created at the same time, but periodically catastrophes cause some to go extinct. And of course, there's no scientific evidence for this at all. But so Cuvier would say that there are many fewer species on the planet today than used to be, because they were all created at the same time and then some die off. We have no evidence for that. Then comes JeanBaptiste de Lamarck. So Lamarck, we call him Lamarck. He came up with a theory called acquired characteristics, or the theory of acquired characteristics. His idea was that characteristics of organisms change, they evolve, but it's over an organism's lifetime, that it has to do with the environment, similar to what Darwin's going to be talking about. But he believed that individuals change within their lifetime, they could evolve, and that once they changed in their lifetime, they could pass their traits on to their offspring. So if they changed and became better somehow, they could pass that on to their offspring. But of course, we know now that that's not consistent with what we understand about genetics. That we know that those traits are inborn, they're in your DNA, they're in your cells, and so we know that that can't be the case. So what Lamarck would say is that the giraffe, for instance, maybe started out with a shorter neck, but he was driven. He was trying and striving to grow a larger neck so that he could eat the leaves at the top. And so over the course of his lifetime, reaching and reaching for the leaves, he would eventually be able to grow a longer neck, and then his offspring would also have long necks. But we know that this isn't the case. That indeed, over time, the giraffe's neck could grow longer, but it's not going to happen in an individual's lifetime, and they're not going to be able to pass that on to their offspring. Okay, so on the scene then comes Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, I want you to know a little bit about him. He was an amateur naturalist. He studied medicine. He was studying to be a doctor, but also for the clergy, that is, to be a priest. His family were doctors, but he also went to seminary. He graduated seminary, so he could have become a priest, but he wasn't happy. He didn't like being a clergyman, and he was always in college very attracted and did really well in the sciences. So he took some time off after graduation from seminary, and he took a job as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle. And it was a 5-year-long world voyage, and it was his job everywhere they stopped around the world to document all of the life that we're seeing, the plant life, the bugs, the animals of all kinds. He drew pictures, he documented everything in a journal, and he took specimens as well. And that was his job. He went around the world doing that. So here is sort of a drawing, a sketch of the HMS Beagle, the ship that he traveled on that went around the world. And the thing is, it influenced Darwin quite a lot, seeing all the different animals and the different environments that existed that Europeans were unfamiliar with. Along the way, he was on the ship for all those years, and he was reading a lot of things. He read some books by this man Lyell, the scientist Lyell, and he was a geologist, and he described the pattern in the rock layers that indicated that the Earth was very, very old. And this was a problem for the early evolutionary theorists because it didn't seem that the Earth was that old, and the changes that we see in organisms couldn't have happened in the short time span. But Lyell had come up with some theory about how the Earth must be very, very, very old based on rock layers and based on what we see in geology. So that was influencing Darwin's thoughts. And then finally, he was also reading by this scientist, Malthus, who Malthus studied human overpopulation and kind of was looking at society, a human society from a social perspective. And he was saying that people have too many kids, and that's why we have poor, starving people. And he was talking about how, you know, some people should not be having so many children because then we have starving people and poor in the world. And he started to thinking about that same thing might be happening in nature, that animals and plants are having too many babies too. And we'll talk more about the theory later, but that's kind of led to some of Darwin's thinking. He finally brought all of that together after he returned from his trip on the Beagle, and he published his Mechanism of Evolution, which we call natural selection. That's his theory, in 1859. This was about, 15, 20 years after he returned from the Beagle. So he really dragged his feet about the whole thing. He didn't really want to publish, but he felt compelled to publish that he really did have, and other people encouraged him, that he really did have a good idea. Finally, the last person I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was this man, Alfred Wallace. At the same time, he had a similar idea to Darwin. He came up with a similar mechanism to natural selection. He also published his ideas, but he published it after Darwin. So Darwin is sort of the father of our understanding of natural selection and evolution, but Alfred Wallace came up with the idea around the same time. So that gives you a little bit of the background. Later on in the week, early next week, we'll talk specifically about the theory and the mechanisms of the theory.